She doesn't know why you're on her mind again, but it's not random. The mind doesn't just reach back into the past without a reason. It recalls what is unresolved, what's unfinished, unprocessed, and unspoken. That's how memory works when it's tied to emotion. The heart doesn't forget easily when the story didn't reach a proper ending. And when a chapter of life feels incomplete, the psyche keeps flipping back to that page, trying to find closure that may never come. People like to think they move on. They tell themselves they're done, that it's over, buried, irrelevant. But you don't get to choose what the unconscious clings to. You might bury something deep, but that doesn't mean it dissolves. It festers, it waits, and it returns, often at strange times, late at night, in quiet moments, when the defenses are low and the distractions run out. That's when you appear again, not because she's decided to think of you, but because something in her still needs to. You see, when something meaningful happens, and it doesn't matter if it ended in anger, confusion, or silence, it carves its place into the psyche. Relationships leave marks, and some of those marks are like open loops. The loop doesn't close until understanding happens, until truth surfaces, until the emotional charge is spent. But if the story ends with a question instead of an answer, with confusion instead of clarity, the mind comes back to it, not to dwell, but to try and make sense of it. That's what might be happening. She doesn't know why, but she's revisiting the narrative. Something about you still doesn't add up. Maybe it's a look you gave her when things were falling apart. Maybe it's something you said or something you didn't. Maybe she thought she knew who you were and now she's not so sure. And now the mind's trying to reconcile that contradiction. Because people want stories to make sense. They need them to. But real human connections are messy. And when you take something as fragile and complex as intimacy and you rip it apart without explanation, you don't just walk away clean. You carry fragments. And sometimes those fragments catch in the gears of thought. And here's something else. People often believe that time is what heals things, that if enough days go by, the pain dulls and the questions disappear. But that's not true. Time only distances you from the event. It doesn't process it. What heals is understanding. What resolves is meaning. And if that never came, if the truth was never spoken, if the hurt was never named, if the parting was clouded by pride or fear, then the wound remains. It's not visible, but it's there. So when she finds herself thinking of you again, it's not because she wants to, it's because something deep down still aches for a thread that ties the pieces together. Sometimes people think they've moved on just because they've stopped talking, but silence is not closure, distance is not resolution, and forgetting is not the same as healing. She may have walked away, and you may have too, but the deeper story never got told. The one with the honest words, the one that admits to the weight of it all, the beauty, the pain, the confusion, the hope. And until that story gets its voice, it stays trapped in the unconscious, waiting, pulling at the edge of thought like a thread that won't let go. So she remembers you, not out of longing necessarily, and not because she wants to go back. She remembers because part of her never got the full truth. And the human psyche is wired to return to the scenes of its unsolved pain. It's trying to make peace, it's trying to let go, but you can't release what you don't understand. That's why you're on her mind again. She might sit there wondering why you're crossing her mind, when everything, at least on the surface, appears to be fine. Maybe she's moved on. Maybe she's even found someone else, filled her calendar, blocked your name from her phone, from her life. And yet, there it is, a thought, an image, a feeling. It rises up without permission, and it catches her off guard. And the mistake we often make is to try to explain it with logic. But emotional memory doesn't operate on logic. It doesn't check the facts or consult your plans. It doesn't care if you've deleted photos or rewritten the past to protect your pride. The emotional parts of the brain, the ones responsible for that flood of familiarity, that ache, that uninvited return, don't answer to reason. Memory isn't a courtroom. It's not a linear file system where everything is sorted, indexed, and shelved away neatly. It's more like a living organism, constantly shifting, responding, forming new connections. And emotional memory, the kind that involves real connection, deep feeling, and unresolved tension, is even more unpredictable. That's because it's stored not just in words or images, but in the body, in sensations, in patterns of response. You might think she's moved on just because she says she has, but the body keeps a different score. She hears a song, passes a place, smells something familiar, and suddenly there's a pull. Uninvited, unintentional, and yet very real. You can't control when or how people remember you, and often they don't even realize they're remembering. It comes as a mood, a shift in atmosphere, a sense that something's missing or misaligned. That's because what you represented wasn't just you. It was a season of her life, a version of herself, a set of possibilities that she once believed in. And those things don't just vanish. They get woven into the fabric of who a person becomes. You were there during moments of vulnerability or hope or confusion. You became entangled with meaning. And meaning doesn't unravel on demand. People think love or connection more broadly is purely rational, that if something didn't work, the brain will simply discard it like outdated software. But we're not machines. We're mythological beings in some sense, driven by stories and symbols and archetypes. And sometimes someone you've tried to forget isn't just a person anymore. They're a representation of something, a feeling, a dream, even a trauma. And when that image reemerges in the mind, it's not always about the individual. It's about what they stood for, what they awakened, and what they left behind. She doesn't know why you're back in her thoughts, and that's partly because memory doesn't knock. It doesn't explain itself. It intrudes, and more often than not, it does so when there's still something emotionally charged beneath the surface. Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's regret, maybe it's longing, or maybe it's just the complexity of being human and the impossibility of tidying up every emotional thread with a clean, logical bow. We are not built for clean breaks. We're built for meaning, and meaning leaves a residue. And here's where it gets difficult. The longer she tries to suppress the memory, the louder it becomes. Because the mind, especially the unconscious, doesn't respond well to being ignored. It doesn't forget just because you want it to. In fact, suppression often strengthens attachment. It solidifies the very thing you're trying to dissolve. So when she wonders why she's thinking about you again, even after she's told herself 100 times that it's over, it's because that part of her never truly let go. Not in the deep sense, not in the way that leaves peace behind instead of confusion. And the truth is, you might be the same way. You might catch yourself remembering someone who you thought was out of your life for good, and maybe you haven't spoken in months or years, but something they said, some look in their eyes, still plays in your mind like a song that never finished. That's not weakness, that's not obsession, that's the cost of real connection. It embeds itself into your psychological structure. It's not about whether she loves you or wants you back. That's not what memory is asking. It's asking, what was that? What did it mean? Who was I then and who am I now? It's trying to map out a story that makes sense of the disruption. Because people need coherence. We need our emotional experiences to form a narrative. And when they don't, we loop. We return again and again to the scenes we don't understand. So no, she doesn't know why you're on her mind again. But that doesn't mean there isn't a reason. Maybe she hasn't said your name out loud in months. Maybe she hasn't dared to think about you with any seriousness, brushing it all off as a phase, a mistake, a lesson. And yet here you are again, not physically, but present in her mind, present in that quiet place between distraction and sleep, where thoughts wander without permission. There's a reason for that. People don't think about just anyone late at night. It's not about preference, it's about presence. And your presence still lingers where meaning once lived. You don't vanish easily from the life of someone who once saw you as important. The world may try to convince people that others are replaceable, that love is transactional, that connection is temporary, but that's not how the soul works. When someone becomes meaningful, when they step into the inner world and participate in the construction of who you are, they don't just leave when the door closes. They leave echoes, traces. And those traces persist sometimes for years, especially if the depth was real. You were part of her sense of meaning, maybe not in a grand cosmic way, but perhaps in a quiet, deeply human way, a moment of vulnerability, a time when her walls came down, and for a second she let herself be seen. And when that happens, when someone helps us feel more real, more known, more alive, it's impossible to erase them. Meaning isn't just an idea, it's a structure. It builds the framework that organizes memory and identity. And you were one of those beams, whether you intended to be or not. So she finds herself remembering, not because she hasn't moved on, not because she's weak or nostalgic, but because something in her still recognizes the weight of what once was. Meaning doesn't dissolve with time. It deepens. It mutates. It shows up in different forms. A dream, a phrase, a sudden ache. It may not even look like missing someone. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness, as a subtle dissatisfaction with the present. Because the past, when it carried weight, casts a shadow forward, and when you were meaningful, your shadow stays. There's a reason people get haunted by memories that feel out of place. The mind isn't just looping for entertainment, it's searching for orientation. It's asking, where am I now compared to where I was then? It's trying to make sense of the present through the lens of the past. If something once felt deeply real and then fell apart, the mind needs to revisit that moment to understand what happened, to determine what was true and what was illusion. It's a kind of inner audit. And you, whether you realize it or not, were part of that truth she once trusted. She doesn't just remember your face or your voice. That's not what sticks. What sticks is how she felt around you. That feeling of alignment, or maybe the chaos that came with it. Because both order and chaos can be meaningful. Sometimes we're drawn to people who bring peace, and other times to those who stir something up inside us, who disrupt the ordinary and force us to see parts of ourselves we didn't know were there. And even if you brought confusion, if it had meaning, it left a mark. People don't crave comfort as much as they crave significance. And if she felt more alive around you, for better or worse, that aliveness is what she misses most. And now, in the quiet moments, you return. Not because she wants you to, but because your presence is still psychologically relevant. She's trying to sort through who she is now, and that inevitably involves tracing the steps of who she was then. You were part of that path, maybe even a turning point. And that kind of presence doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. You may not speak anymore. You may not be part of her life, but you're part of her story. And stories are how we understand ourselves. They're how we find direction in the chaos. She's trying to move forward, but the path forward is tangled up with you because your presence once gave her life shape, even if that shape collapsed, even if it hurt. What matters is that it mattered. And things that matter don't disappear without leaving a trail. That's why you're still on her mind. You might think she's forgotten you, that time has swept away whatever pieces of you remained in her world. But the psyche doesn't work like that. Not really. People don't forget people. Not the ones who reached into the deeper places. Not the ones who touched something raw, unfiltered, unresolved. When you enter someone's psychological world in a real way, you don't just become a memory. You become a symbol. You become part of the architecture of their inner life. Not always consciously, but deeply. And here's something people often miss. When a relationship ends, it doesn't mean the story is over. It often just shifts forms. You stop being the person she texts or argues with or leans on, and you start becoming something else. An image, a question, a shadow. And it's that shadow that keeps showing up. Not necessarily the details of what you said or did, but the deeper presence of you. The part that unsettled her, the part she didn't fully understand, the part that made her confront something about herself. That part doesn't leave. It lodges itself inside the unconscious, and it speaks when she's not listening. That's why she dreams of you. That's why you cross her mind on days that seem otherwise peaceful. You were in some way tied to her transformation, or the possibility of it. Maybe you brought clarity, or maybe you brought chaos. Sometimes it's both. And in either case, you were a mirror. You reflected parts of her that she didn't want to see or couldn't name at the time. That's the thing about people who leave a mark. They challenge us. They stir the waters. They make us feel more, not less. And sometimes they awaken something that won't go back to sleep. So even if the relationship is over, even if she's rationalized everything and moved forward with her life, your image might still linger in the corners of her mind. Not because she misses you in the traditional sense, but because you represent something unresolved. You became part of her psychological shadow. And the shadow, if you're not familiar with it, is the part of ourselves we push away, the part we suppress, the part we can't or won't accept. But that doesn't mean it disappears. It waits, and it returns, often wearing the face of someone we thought we were done with. You might be thinking, that's not my responsibility anymore. And maybe in a literal sense you're right, but psychologically, we don't get to choose what parts of us other people internalize. If you were unpredictable, if you said one thing and did another, if you offered connection and then pulled it away, that contradiction gets absorbed. It becomes part of the structure. And the mind doesn't forget contradiction. It holds on to it because it needs to resolve it. It needs to make sense of what felt incoherent. That's where obsession comes from. That's where late night thoughts originate. She's trying to understand the story, not just of what happened between you, but of what it meant. And here's the hard truth. Sometimes we play roles in people's lives that we don't even understand ourselves. You might have been just trying to survive or figure yourself out or protect something fragile inside you. But she didn't just see your actions. She experienced their impact. And in doing so, she may have encountered a part of herself that wasn't ready, that scared her, that exposed something. And so now, when she thinks of you, it's not just you, it's the part of herself that met you. And that's powerful. That's not casual. That leaves a trace. This is why some people never fully leave each other, even after the contact stops, because their connection wasn't just physical or social, it was symbolic. It struck something archetypal. You became, perhaps unintentionally, part of her personal mythology. And symbols don't fade like memories. They cycle, they reappear. They demand integration until she understands what you meant, what you triggered, what you revealed, what you forced her to see. Your presence will remain unfinished business, not in the romantic sense, but in the psychological one. So when she finds herself thinking of you again, it's not nostalgia. It's not even desire necessarily. It's the shadow speaking. It's the unconscious asking a question. What did that person reflect? What part of me did they hold up to the light? And why does it still hurt when I look at it? That's why you're still on her mind. There's a strange way the mind loops back to moments that didn't make sense at the time, especially when those moments were emotionally charged, when they left something unsaid or unfinished or simply too complex to process in real time. That's what happens with you. You weren't just a person who came and went. You were an event, a disruption. You altered the trajectory of her emotional landscape, and the mind doesn't just let those things go. It revisits them, not for comfort, but for understanding. People underestimate how much confusion impacts memory. When something ends and it doesn't add up, the mind treats it like an open tab. It keeps circling back to it. It doesn't close the window. Not until there's some kind of resolution. And most of the time, we don't get that resolution from the outside. You're not going to call and explain why you said what you said or why you disappeared the way you did. She's not going to message you to demand clarity she already assumes you can't give. But even so, the question remains, why? And this is where memory gets complicated, because it's not just about what happened. It's about the interpretation of what happened. It's about meaning. And when something meaningful ends with ambiguity, it leaves behind a splinter, a tiny shard of psychological dissonance. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't hurt like heartbreak, not exactly. It's more subtle than that, but it's persistent. It's the kind of thing that shows up when she's standing in the shower staring into space and she's watching someone else say the right words and suddenly feels herself drift into a memory of you saying the wrong ones. When she's doing absolutely nothing and your name or the feeling of your presence cuts through the silence without warning. That's not her trying to rekindle something. That's her mind trying to resolve a tension. It's revisiting a narrative that never made full sense. Not because she wants to hold on to it, but because it never fully let her go. And that's what people get wrong. They think if enough time passes, the past stops mattering. But what really happens is that the mind waits for space, for quiet moments, for emotional openings, to bring those unanswered questions back to the surface. They rise again and again until they're finally understood. You may have been a contradiction to her. Someone who is both present and distant, open and guarded, kind one moment and cold the next. That kind of inconsistency doesn't leave clean lines. It leaves confusion. And confusion, when it's tied to emotional significance, becomes a knot in the psyche. A person keeps pulling at it gently, unconsciously, hoping that one day it'll unravel into clarity. So now you're back on her mind. And she doesn't know why. She might not even want it to happen, but something about your presence in her memory still demands attention. Because you don't just forget people who challenged your assumptions. You don't erase those who brought out parts of you you didn't know existed. Whether that was joy, vulnerability, insecurity, anger, whatever it was, it mattered, and meaning doesn't dissolve until it's fully integrated. Even if you think you were just a passing chapter, it's very possible you represented something foundational for her, something that shifted how she saw relationships or herself. And when someone becomes a reference point, even a painful one, the mind will return to that moment again and again, especially when new situations arise that echo the old pattern. She might be with someone new now, and that person might say something or not say something that reminds her of the version of herself she was with you. That's how memory works. It's comparative, it's relational, it's constantly scanning the present in light of the past. And if you were part of a significant pattern, you'll come up again, not because she wants you back, but because the pattern hasn't fully healed. This isn't about romance anymore, not really. It's about resolution. The psyche doesn't like to leave things half-built, and you were part of a structure she started to build, a vision of connection maybe, or a fantasy, or even a warning. And now she's trying to finish that blueprint with the materials she has. But when key pieces are missing, like understanding or closure, the mind sends her back to the original site of construction, back to you, not because she can finish it with you, but because she can't finish it without confronting what happened with you. And that's why even now, without trying, you're still on her mind. There's something profoundly disorienting about missing someone who isn't good for you. It creates a kind of emotional vertigo, like you're standing still, but the ground beneath you is shifting. And that's what she's wrestling with. She doesn't understand why she thinks about you, why your presence reappears in the quiet, why she still dreams of a connection she knows wasn't sustainable. That tension, the push and pull between what felt real and what felt wrong, is not just confusing, it's consuming. Because this isn't about logic. If it were, she'd have moved on completely. She'd have let go without hesitation. But emotional experiences aren't rational. The deeper they go, the less sense they often make. And when someone becomes embedded in the structure of how we feel, how we hope, how we imagine intimacy, they don't just leave cleanly when the relationship ends. They stay, sometimes as a ghost, sometimes as a wound, sometimes as a kind of magnetic pull towards something unresolved. You can't argue your way out of that. You can't reason away longing. It doesn't respond to facts, it responds to meaning. And here's the core of it. She doesn't know why you're on her mind again because she's at war with herself. A part of her remembers what it cost to be close to you, the uncertainty, the disappointment, the quiet ache of unmet expectations. But another part of her remembers what it awakened. Maybe you made her feel seen in a way others hadn't. Maybe you broke down a wall she'd built up for years. Maybe even in your chaos, there was a strange kind of clarity, not about you, but about her. And that contradiction is hard to forget. It's hard to walk away from someone who made you feel both more alive and more unsure than you've ever felt. When people say they miss someone, they often don't realize they're not missing the person, they're missing the part of themselves that came alive in that presence. She's not trying to pull you back into her life. She's trying to reclaim the emotional intensity, the sense of urgency, the clarity that came with loving you or trying to. Because even if you were wrong for her, even if the relationship couldn't work, the feelings it brought to the surface were undeniably real. And realness is addictive in a world full of facades. So she returns in thought, not to fantasize, but to understand. She walks the halls of those old conversations, those moments that went unspoken, the arguments that never got resolved. Not because she's stuck, but because she's trying to sort what was true from what was hopeful. She's trying to make peace with the part of herself that still sees you as unfinished business. And in a way, she's mourning, not just the loss of you, but the loss of what she thought was possible with you. This is what's so complex about healing. We don't only grieve people, we grieve potential. We grieve the version of ourselves we became when we were reaching for something we thought mattered. And if you were part of that reach, if you were tied to a moment where she believed in something bigger than herself, something romantic, transcendent, maybe even redemptive, then you're part of what she's trying to bury and resurrect at the same time. She knows, on some level, that you weren't good for her, that something about your presence chipped away at her peace. But we don't always miss what was good. We miss what was intense, what was formative, what demanded something from us. And if your presence challenged her, if it forced her to ask hard questions or confront old wounds, then, of course, you're still present in her mind. Because people don't forget their lessons. And they especially don't forget the ones that came disguised as love. And maybe she doesn't talk about you anymore. Maybe she's told herself and her friends that it's all in the past. But the unconscious doesn't care about declarations. It moves on its own rhythm. And when something isn't fully processed, it circles back, not to torment, but to integrate. The mind wants to understand. The soul wants to feel whole again. And if you were part of what broke her open, then her psyche will keep pulling on that thread until it can weave it into something that finally makes sense. She doesn't miss the pain. She doesn't want the chaos. But she still carries your name in places that ache quietly. Not because she's weak, not because she's clinging, but because the connection was real, even if it was wrong. And realness, when it's rare, leaves echoes long after it's gone. That's why you're still on her mind